Emily pushed open the front door of her tiny apartment, balancing Max's art project under one arm and her work bag slung precariously over her shoulder. The faint scent of burnt toast still lingered in the kitchen, a cruel reminder of the breakfast attempt that went south. Max shuffled behind her, clutching his backpack and a small cardboard box that held his beloved diorama, today's all-important art project for school. His cheeks were flushed with excitement, a sharp contrast to the storm of frustration brewing inside her. She juggled the car keys in her hand and muttered a silent prayer as she reached the parking lot. "Come on, just this once, work for me," she whispered. The engine groaned, sputtered, and died in defiance. She tried again, her hand gripping the wheel like it might convince the car to come back to life through sheer willpower. Nothing. Not even a sputter. "Is the car broken again?" Max's voice cut through the air, full of curiosity, not yet tinged with the frustration Emily was battling to suppress. "No big deal," Emily forced a smile, masking the irritation gnawing at her. "We'll figure it out." The clock on the dashboard mocked her as the minutes slipped away. She grabbed her phone, her thumbs flying as she pulled up her ride-sharing app. No drivers available. She checked the cab service. The same. Emily felt the knot in her stomach tighten. It was rush hour, and every option she had counted on seemed to evaporate. "Okay," she said aloud, though mostly to herself. "We'll take the bus." Max's eyes lit up at the mention of the bus, an adventure in his mind, an ordeal in hers. She checked the schedule on her phone and groaned. The nearest stop was 3 blocks away, and the route would only take them within a 15-minute walk of the school. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option. "Grab your project, buddy." "We're walking," she said, hitching her bag higher on her shoulder. The morning chill bit at her as they hurried down the sidewalk, her boots clacking against the pavement while Max struggled to keep pace. She glanced down at his tiny legs moving double time and felt a pang of guilt for rushing him. But the guilt was quickly overshadowed by the mounting frustration as she glanced at her watch. They were already running late. They arrived at the bus stop just in time to see the bus pulling up. Emily pulled Max closer and maneuvered them through the small crowd boarding. The driver gave her a look as she fumbled for her fare, nearly dropping her bag in the process. The doors hissed shut behind them, and she scanned for an empty seat, finding none. She gripped a pole with one hand, holding Max steady with the other as the bus lurched forward. Her mind raced, ticking through the logistics of the day. Drop Max at school. Get to work somehow, probably late. Apologize to her boss. Again. It was the never-ending juggle of single motherhood, and while she had grown used to it, mornings like this tested even her deepest reserves of patience. Max tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, is my project okay?" She glanced down at the precariously balanced box and nodded. "It's perfect, Max. Just hold on tight." His face broke into a proud smile, and for a moment, the weight on her shoulders lightened. She squeezed his hand, reminding herself that no matter how chaotic things got, this little boy was her everything. They'd figure it out, just like always. The bus ride felt eternal, each stop stretching her patience further as more people squeezed in, jostling her and Max. Her coffee, safely tucked into a travel mug in her bag, was the only thing she had managed to hold onto from her morning routine. She thought about it longingly, imagining the first warm sip as a small reward for surviving this ordeal. The bus finally wheezed to a stop near their destination, and Emily nudged Max toward the exit. "Almost there," she said, more to herself than to him. Her bag slipped down her arm as she tried to keep everything in balance: Max's hand, the project, her bag, and the tantalizing thought of her untouched coffee. She adjusted her grip and quickened her pace. Just a few more blocks, and this morning's disaster would be behind her. At least, that's what she told herself. The coffee? It was the one thing working today. Surely, something had to go right. Right? Her mind went back to the moments before they left the house. The small kitchen buzzed with the last frantic moments of Emily's chaotic morning. The coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the air with the rich, comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Amidst the scattered remnants of Max's breakfast and the looming chaos of the day, it felt like the only thing going right. She stood for a moment, leaning on the counter, letting the warm scent calm her frayed nerves. Emily stepped off the bus, pulling Max close as the crowded street enveloped them. The hum of the city seemed louder than usual, horns blaring, footsteps pounding against the pavement, voices blending into an indistinct roar. She gripped Max's hand tightly, her other hand juggling her bag and the still warm coffee mug. The diorama Max carried teetered precariously as he tried to keep pace with her determined strides. "Just a few more blocks, sweetheart," she said, her voice strained but upbeat. Her eyes darted between the path ahead and Max, her mind racing with the ticking clock. The school bell would ring in minutes. They could still make it, but there was no room for delays. The sidewalk was a maze of hurried bodies. Emily muttered, "Excuse me," after bumping into a distracted pedestrian and tightened her grip on Max's small hand. Her bag slipped lower on her shoulder, its contents shifting with every step. She clamped her arm around it, attempting to readjust without losing her grip on the coffee. The lid wobbled slightly, but she steadied it with a quick tilt, relief washing over her. The last thing she needed was another spill. Max stumbled briefly, his foot catching on a raised crack in the sidewalk. Emily stopped, crouching slightly to check him over. "You okay, buddy?" He nodded, but his lip quivered as he glanced nervously at the diorama in his hands. "It's fine," he said, holding it up for her to see. "You're doing great," she reassured him with a quick pat on his shoulder. She smiled despite the stress, drawing strength from his determination. "Let's keep going." They resumed their brisk pace, weaving through the throng of people. A man with a briefcase brushed past her, nearly knocking her off balance. She exhaled sharply, muttering under her breath, and surged forward, trying to close the gap between them and the school. Then it happened. Her foot caught slightly as someone stepped into her path. In her haste to dodge them, her elbow nudged Max's shoulder, and the coffee mug tilted dangerously. She spun, trying to steady herself, but collided squarely with a tall figure she hadn't noticed until it was too late. The hot coffee sloshed out of the mug, soaking the front of the man's impeccably tailored suit. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." Emily gasped, her voice a frantic pitch above the street noise. She instinctively reached out, her hand brushing the man's arm as if that might somehow undo the damage. "I didn't see you. It's been a morning, well, it's been a morning, and my son, and the bus, and, oh no, your suit. Oh no, no, no." The man took a step back, his expression shifting from startled to irritated as he inspected the damage. His charcoal gray suit was marred by a large, damp stain spreading across his chest and lapel. He held his arms slightly out, as though the coffee might somehow leap off his clothes if he stood still long enough. Emily continued, her words tumbling out like an unstoppable flood. "This is my fault. I wasn't paying attention, and wait, I'll pay for the dry cleaning. Just let me give you my number or something. I mean, I don't really have time because we're late, very late, and my son's project. Max, are you okay?" "Oh no, the project." "Ma'am," the man began, but her frantic words drowned him out. "I am so sorry." Emily babbled, her face flushed as she gestured helplessly with her free hand, the other clutching the coffee cup now mostly empty. "I wasn't looking where I was going, and my morning has been an absolute disaster. Bus running late, art projects everywhere, and then your suit. Oh, no, it's ruined. I can pay for the cleaning or..." Ryan stood frozen, his body stiff and his mind unable to process the storm of apologies spilling from her. He was about to try interrupting again when his eyes landed on her face. It hit him like a freight train. Her. He knew her. The features were unmistakable, her hair now pulled into a loose bun, but her eyes were the same, her voice like a thread pulling him backward through time. Memories rushed in, vivid and painful. And then, as if time itself slowed, his gaze shifted downward. The boy. Ryan's breath caught. The world around him dimmed, the honking horns and chattering pedestrians fading into white noise. The boy's face, wide-eyed, curious, and oddly calm amid the chaos, hit him harder than Emily's frantic apologies. The shape of his jaw, the way he tilted his head, the faint dimple in his cheek. Ryan's chest tightened as his mind raced to connect the impossible dots. Oblivious to his reaction, Emily kept talking. "Look, I'll give you my number, and you can send me the cleaning bill, though honestly, I should just pay for the suit, but I'm running late, and my son needs to." Her words faltered as she finally lifted her gaze to his face. The apology died on her lips as the color drained from her cheeks. Her pulse quickened. She knew those eyes, that expression, disbelief mixed with something much heavier. Recognition dawned, swift and undeniable. Her breath caught. Ryan? Her own shock had barely registered when she noticed his expression shift again. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something much deeper. She followed his gaze instinctively, her eyes dropping to Max, who stood quietly by her side, gripping his diorama. The realization hit her like a wave. She didn't need to hear the words. His face said it all. He was seeing Max, really seeing him, and everything was falling into place. Emily's chest tightened as her mind screamed for a way to shield her son, to stop this before it unraveled completely. Her eyes darted back to Ryan's, her own fear and determination meeting his frozen disbelief. Their gazes locked, and in that charged moment, nothing else existed, not the street, not the crowd, not the coffee stain on his suit. Only them, and the silent truth that hung between them. Neither spoke. Neither moved. The weight of unspoken words pressed down, heavy and irrevocable. And then the moment stretched into stillness, leaving them both suspended in a fragile, electrified silence. The memory hit Ryan like a sudden gust of wind, pulling him from the bustling street and back to a quieter, simpler time. He was standing in the campus library, leaning against a bookshelf with a stack of economics textbooks under one arm. The hum of fluorescent lights and faint whispers of students studying created a calming background noise. That's when he saw her for the first time. Emily had been at a nearby table, her curly hair falling over her face as she scribbled furiously in a notebook. Her lips moved slightly, mouthing the words she was writing, completely lost in her own world. There was something magnetic about her, something that made him forget why he'd even come to the library in the first place. He couldn't look away. He had walked over, pretending to search for a book on her side of the table. She didn't notice him at first, so he cleared his throat. Her head shot up, and their eyes met. She blinked, a little startled, before offering him a shy smile. "Hi," he had said, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. "Hi," she replied, her pencil still poised above her notebook. "Do you, know where I could find something on business ethics?" It was a terrible excuse, considering they were in the economics section, but it was all he could think of. Emily had tilted her head, her lips curving into a smirk. "You mean the books right behind you?" Ryan turned, realizing his mistake, and laughed awkwardly. "Right. Thanks." From that awkward beginning, something sparked. Ryan found himself drawn to her warmth, her wit, and the way her mind worked so beautifully. Emily, in turn, admired his ambition, his sharp intellect, and the boyish charm that softened his sometimes too serious demeanor. Their study sessions turned into coffee dates, then late-night walks across campus, where they shared their dreams and plans for the future. Emily had talked about becoming an art therapist, combining her passion for creativity with her desire to help others. She painted vivid pictures of the life she envisioned, full of color and purpose. Ryan, ever the pragmatist, had his sights set on the corporate world, imagining himself in corner offices and boardrooms. Their dreams were different, but they fit together somehow, like two pieces of a puzzle. They spent endless hours together, stealing moments between classes and study sessions. On warm afternoons, they'd sit under the big oak tree by the campus quad, Emily sketching while Ryan read. She often teased him for his serious nature, poking fun at his rigid schedules and color-coded planners. He, in turn, marveled at her ability to find beauty in chaos. "I think you're secretly an artist," she had once told him, watching as he carefully outlined a budget for their imaginary post-college trip to Europe. "Hardly," he had laughed. "I just like order. Someone has to keep us from ending up broke in Paris." Emily had smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "You keep me grounded, you know that? When I get too lost in my head, you bring me back." He'd kissed her then, under the shade of that oak tree, thinking that if he could freeze time, he would have stayed in that moment forever. But forever was fleeting. The cracks began to show during their senior year. Ryan's internship with a prestigious firm demanded more of his time, and Emily's studio art classes grew more intense. Their schedules rarely aligned, and the once easy flow of their relationship became strained. They argued more, about time, priorities, and the future. One night, after a particularly heated fight about his decision to accept a job offer across the country, Ryan had said something he would regret for years. "You don't understand, Emily. This is my chance. I can't throw it away for some dream that might not even pan out." Her face had crumpled at his words, the hurt in her eyes cutting deeper than he expected. "You think what I want doesn't matter? That my dreams aren't worth fighting for?" "That's not what I meant," he had said, running a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself and the situation. I need to do this. For us." "For us?" Emily's voice was small but sharp. "Or for you?" The silence that followed was deafening. She had turned and walked away, and he had let her go, thinking it was just another argument. But the next day, when he went to her dorm to apologize, she wasn't there. A mutual friend told him she had taken some time off to visit family, needing space to clear her head. She didn't come back, at least not to him. He threw himself into his new job, convincing himself it was for the best. He told himself that she'd be better off, that he was sparing her from the long hours, the stress, and the demands of his career. But the empty space she left behind followed him like a shadow. The echo of Ryan's voice faded, and so did the bustling sidewalk. In its place, Emily's past unfolded, raw and vivid, as though she were standing in the moments all over again. The day she found out she was pregnant was overcast, the kind of gray morning that felt more like dusk. She had sat in the bathroom of her tiny apartment, the test shaking slightly in her hand as the reality of the situation settled over her. The two pink lines stared back at her, certain and unmoving, as the questions and fears swirled in her mind. Her first instinct was to call Ryan. She picked up her phone and stared at his number, her thumb hovering over the call button. But the last conversation they'd had replayed in her mind, his excitement about the job, his certainty about the future he was chasing. She could hear his voice, full of hope and determination, and she knew. Telling him would only complicate everything. He had made his choice, and she couldn't derail his plans, not when he'd been so sure of what he wanted. Emily made the decision then to face it on her own. It wasn't born out of anger or spite but out of a fierce desire to protect what little stability she had left. She told herself she was doing the right thing, sparing them both from a mess they couldn't untangle. Those early months were lonely, her small support system growing smaller as the weight of her pregnancy became more apparent. Her parents had been disappointed but not surprised when she told them. Their small-town values came with a dose of judgment, wrapped in concern, and while they offered help, it came with the unspoken expectation that she would move back home. Emily couldn't bear the thought of returning to a place that felt too small for the life she needed to build. She packed her things and moved to the city, renting a cramped studio apartment with peeling paint and drafty windows. The space barely held a bed and a small table, but it was hers. The city was noisy and chaotic, but in its vastness, Emily found a strange sense of possibility. Here, she could disappear and reinvent herself. The work was grueling. She took a job as a waitress at a 24-hour diner, spending long shifts on her feet and smiling through exhaustion for tips that barely covered her rent. She saved what she could, making sacrifices wherever possible, and started buying small items for the baby, a second-hand crib, a few onesies, and a soft, yellow blanket she hoped would bring warmth to their tiny home. When Max was born, everything changed. He arrived in the middle of a summer storm, thunder rumbling outside as she held him for the first time. His tiny face was scrunched, his fists balled up as he let out a determined wail. Emily had laughed through her tears, overwhelmed by the intensity of her love for him. He was small but perfect, and in that moment, she knew she would do anything for him. The first year was a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Max was colicky, crying for hours at a time, and Emily often found herself pacing the apartment at 3 a.m, whispering lullabies through her own tears of exhaustion. But even in the hardest moments, she never regretted her choice. Max was hers, and she loved him with a ferocity that gave her strength she didn't know she had. As he grew, their little apartment became a home. She painted the walls a soft gray, hanging up some of her own artwork to brighten the space. Her sketchbooks, once pushed aside, made their way back to the table, and she would draw while Max napped, rediscovering the joy she had once found in creating. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was theirs, and it was enough. Money was always tight, and the challenges never stopped coming. When Max was 2, he got sick with a high fever that left Emily panicked and rushing him to the nearest urgent care. The doctor assured her it was a common virus, but the medical bills that followed were anything but comforting. She took on extra shifts at the diner, working until her body ached just to keep up with the mounting expenses. Still, Emily found ways to bring joy into their lives. She took Max to the park on her days off, pushing him on the swings and cheering him on as he conquered the small jungle gym. She introduced him to art early, handing him crayons and watching as he scribbled with glee. When he proudly held up his first drawing, a messy mix of colors she couldn't quite decipher, she had framed it and hung it in the kitchen, declaring it a masterpiece. Her love for Max was boundless, but the loneliness was always there, lurking in the quiet moments. Nights were the hardest, when the apartment was silent, and the weight of her choices pressed down on her. She thought of Ryan sometimes, wondering where he was, what he was doing, and whether he ever thought of her. She imagined him in his polished office, surrounded by success and ambition, and told herself she had made the right decision to let him go. He didn't belong in this world she had built, and she didn't belong in his. But the questions lingered. Would he have wanted to be part of Max's life? Would he have been angry? Supportive? She didn't know, and she had convinced herself it didn't matter. Max had her, and that was enough. As Max got older, their bond deepened. He was curious and bright, always asking questions and exploring the world with wide-eyed wonder. Emily marveled at his resilience, his ability to find joy in even the simplest things. He reminded her so much of herself, but there were moments, little expressions or quirks, when she saw Ryan in him. It was a bittersweet reminder of what could have been. Emily had worked hard to create a stable life for her son, but seeing Ryan again, standing there on the sidewalk, had shaken her. She had spent years protecting Max from the uncertainty of her past, building walls around their little world to keep it safe. But now, those walls felt fragile, like they might crumble at any moment. The thought terrified her. Max was her whole world, and she wasn't sure she was ready to let anyone else in, even if that someone was Ryan. Ryan's hand hung limply at his side, his gaze fixed on Max with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he gestured faintly toward the boy, as if trying to make sense of what was standing right in front of him. Emily didn't give him the chance. Her mind raced as she stepped slightly in front of Max, her voice breaking the thick silence. "I'm so sorry about the coffee," she began, her words tumbling out quickly, her tone unnaturally cheerful. "It's been a hectic morning, and we really need to get to school, so if you'll excuse us." "No way," Ryan interrupted, his voice hoarse but firm. "I want to know what's going on." Her heart stopped for a moment. She tightened her grip on Max's hand, her other hand gripping the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Nothing is going on," she said sharply, her voice dropping to a low, warning tone. "We're late, and I can't." "Mom, who's this?" Max's small voice cut through the tension like a knife. His curious, innocent eyes darted between the two adults. "Is everything okay?" Emily froze. She turned to Max, kneeling slightly to meet his gaze, forcing a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," she said softly. "This is just," she glanced up at Ryan, her expression shifting into something colder and harder. "A warning." Ryan understood immediately. Whatever was happening, whatever questions he had, she didn't want them aired in front of Max. The protective fire in her eyes was unmistakable. He nodded slightly, taking a step back. "Everything's fine," he echoed, his voice quieter, softer now. "Don't worry, buddy." Emily straightened, her hand still on Max's shoulder, her posture rigid. "We need to go," she said firmly, tugging gently at Max's hand. "I'll walk with you," Ryan said quickly, taking a step forward. "No," Emily snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "We're fine. Really. Just go about your day." Before Ryan could respond, his phone buzzed loudly in his pocket. He glanced down, the screen lighting up with a familiar name. Work. Always work. His jaw tightened as he hesitated, caught between the call and the moment in front of him. "You should get that," Emily said, her voice flat and tired. The look she gave him was cutting, weary and knowing, as though this was exactly what she expected from him. "Of course, you have to take it." Her words weren't loud, but the weight behind them hit him like a punch to the gut. He saw the unspoken judgment in her eyes, the way she looked at him like this was who he had always been, a man who put work above everything else. "Emily," he started, but she cut him off with a small shake of her head. "Goodbye, Ryan," she said, her tone final, as she turned and walked away with Max. Her steps were quick, her posture stiff, but she didn't look back. Ryan stood there, his phone buzzing insistently in his hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He watched them disappear into the crowd, Max's small hand still tucked safely in Emily's grasp. The noise of the city returned around him, but all he could hear were her parting words, echoing in his mind. "Of course, you have to take it." Emily sat at the cafe table, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. She stared at the swirling foam on top, though her mind was far from the small comfort it offered. Across from her, Ryan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his face a mask of determination and frustration. The air between them was thick, weighed down by the conversation neither of them wanted to have, but both knew was inevitable. "Thank you for coming," Ryan said finally, his voice measured but tight. Emily didn't look up. "You didn't really give me a choice," she replied, her tone clipped. "The texts, the calls, what was I supposed to do? Ignore you forever?" "Wouldn't be the first time," Ryan shot back, his words sharp enough to make her flinch. He softened slightly when he saw her reaction, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "I'm not here to fight with you, Emily. I just want the truth." She sighed, lifting the cup to her lips but barely tasting the coffee. "The truth about what?" "Don't do that," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping. "Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. Is Max my son?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Emily's grip on the cup tightened, her knuckles white as she stared at the table. She didn't answer right away, and Ryan let out an exasperated sigh. "For God's sake, Emily," he said, his voice rising slightly before he reined it in. "Just tell me. Am I his father?" "Yes." The word was quiet but clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. Emily finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Max is your son." Ryan leaned back, his face a mixture of shock, anger, and something else, something she couldn't quite place. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his hand running through his hair as he processed the revelation. "You kept this from me," he said finally, his voice low but trembling with emotion. "You knew all this time, and you didn't tell me." Emily bristled, setting her cup down with a slight thud. "What would you have done, Ryan? Quit your job? Moved back? You were halfway across the country, building the life you wanted. I wasn't going to blow that up by showing up and saying, 'Hey, guess what?' That wasn't your decision to make." Ryan snapped, his voice rising again. Heads turned in the cafe, but he didn't care. "You had no right to keep him from me." She met his anger head on, her voice cold and steady. "I had every right. I was the one who was there, Ryan. I was the one who raised him, who stayed up all night when he was sick, who worked double shifts to keep a roof over his head. Where were you?" "I didn't know," he shot back, his hands slamming onto the table. "You didn't give me the chance to know. Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out like this? To see him on the street and realize." "Don't make this about you," Emily interrupted, her voice shaking now. "This isn't about your feelings or your ego. This is about Max. He's happy. He's safe. I did what I thought was best for him. And you think keeping me out of his life was best?" Ryan's voice softened, but the pain in it was undeniable. "He deserves to know who his father is. He deserves to know me." Emily looked away, her throat tightening. "I'm not saying you can't be in his life," she said quietly. "But this is complicated, Ryan. He's not some blank slate you can just walk into. He's my son, and his world is stable. I won't let you disrupt that." "Stable?" Ryan repeated, his tone incredulous. "You think I'm here to disrupt his life? I want to be part of it, Emily. I want to know my son." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but fear kept her defenses up. "And what happens when work calls?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. "When the next big opportunity comes along? Max doesn't need someone who's in and out of his life. He needs consistency." "That's not fair," Ryan said, his voice softer but no less determined. "I've changed, Emily. I'm not the same person I was back then." "Maybe not," she said, her eyes meeting his again. "But I can't take that risk. Not with him." Ryan's jaw tightened, the frustration and helplessness in his expression clear. He took a deep breath, then leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "If you don't let me be part of his life, I'll fight for it. I'll go to court if I have to." Emily's stomach dropped, her breath catching. "You wouldn't," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I will," Ryan replied, his tone steady. "Because he's my son, Emily. And I'm not walking away from him." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For years, she had protected Max from this very moment, from the upheaval she knew Ryan's presence could bring. And now, it was here, and there was no escaping it. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We're done here," she said, grabbing her bag. "Emily," Ryan began, but she cut him off. "I need time to think," she said sharply. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk. Until then, leave us alone." She turned and walked out, her chest heaving as she stepped onto the busy sidewalk. The weight of the conversation hung heavy on her shoulders, but she pushed forward, blending into the crowd. Behind her, Ryan sat at the table, his hands clenched into fists, determination hardening in his gaze. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Emily stood in the park, her arms crossed as she watched Ryan kneel beside Max at the art table. The community center had set up a small craft station under a large oak tree, and Max was fully immersed in painting a cardboard rocket. His tongue stuck out in concentration as Ryan held the edge of the cardboard steady, listening intently as Max explained the importance of adding space flames for authenticity. It had been a week since their heated conversation at the cafe, and Emily still felt the sting of Ryan's words. But what stayed with her more than the anger was the sincerity in his voice when he said he wanted to know Max. She had spent years protecting her son from the what-ifs and unknowns of Ryan's absence, but seeing them together now, it was clear Max wasn't just her son anymore. He was theirs, and she couldn't deny Ryan that truth any longer. She had agreed to this meeting reluctantly, setting clear terms. It would be in public, with her present, and it was about Max, not the past, not them, just their son. Watching them now, though, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was hesitation, yes, but also a flicker of something softer, something that reminded her of the Ryan she had once loved. Max looked up suddenly, waving his paintbrush in her direction. "Mom! Look at this," he called out, his excitement bright and uncontainable. "Dad says the flames make it look real." The word hit her like a jolt, though she managed to keep her expression steady. She hadn't told Max to call Ryan Dad, hadn't even introduced the idea. But he had done it on his own, with the ease and innocence only a child could bring. And the way Ryan's face lit up at the word told her everything she needed to know. "It's great, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile as she walked over. She crouched beside them, her hand brushing over Max's hair. "You're doing an amazing job." Ryan glanced at her, his expression unreadable but softer than it had been the last time they spoke. "He's really talented," he said, his voice low. "You've done an incredible job with him." Emily didn't respond, her focus on Max as he reached for another brush. But his words stayed with her, a quiet acknowledgement of the years she had spent building a life for their son. As the afternoon went on, the tension between them eased. Ryan stayed at Max's side, encouraging him, asking questions, and laughing at his wild explanations of the alien defenses the rocket needed. Emily stayed close, watching, her heart tugging in ways she hadn't expected. It was clear Ryan wasn't there out of obligation. He genuinely wanted to be part of Max's world. Later, as Max ran off to play on the jungle gym, Ryan stood beside Emily, his hands in his pockets. They watched in silence for a moment before he spoke. "Thank you for letting me see him." She nodded, her arms still crossed, though her posture had softened. "He seems happy," she said quietly. "That's all I've ever wanted for him." Ryan turned to her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want that too. I know I've missed so much, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Emily looked at him, her guard still up but beginning to crack. "I need you to understand something," she said firmly. "This isn't just about showing up when it's convenient or playing the hero. Max needs stability. He needs someone who's there for him, always. If you can't be that, I won't let you hurt him." "I get it," Ryan said, his tone resolute. "I'm not here to hurt him, Emily. I'm here because I want to be his father. I want to be part of his life, completely." She studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of hesitation, but found none. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "But we do this on my terms. Slowly. Max comes first." "Always," Ryan said without hesitation. Over the following weeks, Ryan became a regular part of Max's routine. He showed up to soccer practices, cheered from the sidelines, and took Max out for ice cream afterward. He spent hours helping with homework, patiently explaining math problems and marveling at Max's artistic talent. Each time Emily saw them together, her walls chipped away just a little more. Max adored him, and the bond between them grew quickly. Ryan wasn't just a visitor in their lives, he was becoming part of the foundation. He listened to Max's stories, asked questions about his interests, and made him laugh in ways that left Emily smiling despite herself. One evening, after Max had fallen asleep, Ryan stayed behind. They sat in the living room, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around them like a fragile truce. Emily sipped her tea, her nerves on edge, while Ryan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Thank you for giving me this chance," he said, breaking the silence. "I know it wasn't easy for you." "It's not about me," she said, her voice calm but guarded. "It's about Max." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her. "I've missed a lot of time, Emily. But I don't want to miss any more. Not with him. And not with you." Her breath caught, and she looked away, her heart racing. "Ryan. I'm not saying this to complicate things," he said quickly. "I know we have a lot to figure out, and I'm willing to take it slow. But seeing you again, seeing what you've done for Max, it's reminded me of everything I gave up. And I don't want to lose you again." She hesitated, her hands tightening around her mug. The vulnerability in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, it was the Ryan she had fallen in love with years ago. And despite everything, part of her wanted to believe him. "I don't know if we can get back to that place," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Too much has happened." "Maybe," he said softly. "But maybe we can start somewhere new." She looked at him, her defenses crumbling just a little more. "We'll see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan smiled, a flicker of hope in his eyes. And for the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to hope too. The next weekend, they went to the park as a family. Max ran ahead, laughing as he chased a kite, while Emily and Ryan walked side by side.